Welcome to the 2025 Sage-CASBS Award Lecture, co-presented by Sage Publishing and the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences. A special welcome to all of you who are visiting our beautiful campus for the first time. I'm Sarah Soll, and I'm the Sarah Miller McCune Director of CASBS, which is a very special title because Sarah Miller McCune is the founder of Sage. And as many of you know, Sarah endowed CASBS's directorship in 2015, and we are forever grateful to her for doing so. I want to acknowledge the presence of Doug McCune, a Sage director representing the company here today. Welcome, Doug. We'll hear from Doug after today's talk when he presents the award plaque and award to Daron Acemoglu. I also want to thank two special people here tonight who were part of the Sage-CASBS Award Selection Committee. We have with us Aaron Shaw and Margaret O'Mara, two former fellows here at CASBS who made the trip here to be part of this special event. Thank you, Margaret. Thank you, Aaron. Also with us tonight is Abby Rumsey, who's the chair of CASBS's Board of Directors. Abby is also joined by Mubarak Imam, who will be here momentarily, Chen Li and Paul Ritchie, as well as board member emeritus John Seeley Brown, who will shortly be here as well. So welcome board members. This award was established in 2013, and it recognizes outstanding achievements in the social and behavioral sciences. The award underscores the role of social science in enriching and enhancing public discourse, public policy, and good governance. Sage is the proud funder of this award. If you look in your print program, which you should have near you, I hope, you will see the list of previous winners. And so, Daron, you are joining a good company of former winners of this award. Now let me take a moment to formally introduce this year's winner, Daron Acemoglu. Daron's list of accomplishments and accolades is long and stunning, and our early announcement went into great depth with many of these. So I promise to be very brief so that you can hear from Daron. As many of you know, Daron is the institute professor at MIT, where he's held appointments since 1993. Most of us know that of his great work examining the causes of long-term economic growth and the comparative study of prosperity among nation states. This work, of course, gained public attention and public consciousness through books such as Why Nations Fail, The Narrow Corridor, and most recently, Power and Progress, Our 1,000-Year Struggle Over Technology and Prosperity. For these works, and many others, Daron and his frequent collaborators, James Robinson and Simon Johnson, were awarded the 2024 Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences. Today at CASBS, we were joined by several other Nobel Award winners, and we have, in fact, with us tonight, Paul Milgram and Al Roth. Bob Wilson was supposed to be here but fell ill, and of course, earlier today we had Hiro Imbens with us as well. So this has been a day of great celebration of our friend Daron. And I will say one last little thing before I go on, a little bit more about Daron. And central, of course, to his work has been the importance of inclusive economic and political institutions for sustained growth and development. And these are topics that resonate very deeply with all CASBS fellows, present and past. And that's why this is such an important, I think, award for us to bestow on you today, Daron. And I'm going to just bring you to the subject of Daron's talk today. It's a new framework that provides a more holistic account of how institutions evolve and impact technology and prosperity, as well as some of the frameworks of the applications of this framework today with some of the most pressing challenges that we have. And so now, friends, Please join me in welcoming and celebrating the winner of the 2025 Sage-CASBS Award, Daron Acemoglu.
Thank you so much for this lovely introduction and the great hospitality and generosity. It's my true pleasure to be here in the abstract, but also in the concrete of receiving this prize, which is, of course, a great honor, given where it sits in the center of social sciences and the list of previous awardees. So what I'm going to try to do is try to give a unifying sort of account of two parts of my research and then try to bring them to some of the current issues that are relevant for the future of shared prosperity and democracy, as well as other challenges that we may be facing at the moment. So I'm going to take bits and pieces and try to put them together in some way, trying to make it coherent, but you'll be the judge of whether that works or not. And feel free to ask questions as I go along, so make this a more academic, interactive thing. So institutions, technology, and prosperity. So the reason why I emphasize these three words in the title is because those are pretty much the things that have drawn me to economics and have been the centerpiece of what I have tried to understand for much of the work that I've done. So the first introduction that I had to some economics ideas was when I was a teenager worrying about why the country where I was growing up, Turkey, had both political and economic problems, and I tried to read about it, although I didn't know what to think or what to read. But that experience was formative enough that I decided to study economics on the basis of that. Little did I know that that's not what most of economics covered, but then when I realized what economics was, I loved that, so I stayed with it, which sort of was a good decision. So the issues that were at the back of my mind at the time, you can think about them in terms of institutions and prosperity. So in some sense, whether there is a link between how society is organized, exactly what dimensions of that we need to look at, that's a question I'll mention briefly, and some dimensions of economic performance. It could be unemployment, it could be inequality, but the one that perhaps the easiest to think about is just some measure of prosperity, like how on average well-off a country is. So here is one way of viewing that relationship. On the horizontal axis, here in this picture, I have one of many measures of institutions that one can use. This comes from the World Bank. It's the Rule of Law Index that mixes a bunch of things. But essentially, it has a heavy element of how secure property rights are, how well laws are obeyed, political arrangements, whether you have the ability to exercise political power without any constraints, as well as some aspect of equality before the law and things like that. On the vertical axis, I have GDP per capita, and you see a huge variation in the horizontal axis, and that captures what Jim Robinson and I, for example, in our work called inclusive versus extractive institutions. At the right end, those are the ones that have better scores of this Rule of Law Index, which actually also have much better scores, whatever index that you look at. And at the bottom, those are the ones that we would call extractive institutions, where things are not secure. Institutions are used by some groups in order to be able to either boost their economic fortunes or their social and political power. And on the vertical axis, you have this GDP per capita measure that also has an enormous amount of variation. In fact, it's a mind-boggling amount of variation there. In the very globalized, hyper-connected world that we live in, the top 10 countries have about more than 60-fold the income per capita level of the bottom 10 countries. Really mind-boggling level of inequality. What is, of course, very visible here is that there is a very strong statistical association. So the countries that have, according at least to these sorts of measures, better institutions are the ones that have much higher levels of GDP per capita. So that's as much as I would have been able to think about when I was a teenager, even if I had these sorts of data. But of course, as economists and as social scientists, we are very much conditioned in thinking about what that relationship means. And the fact that institutions are choices that societies themselves make about how they are governed, with many constraints and many accidents, of course, along the way. But still, they're not God-given or nature-given in any sense. So you have to worry about whether it is that the causality goes from prosperity to institutions. Perhaps richer countries can afford better institutions. There's certainly some of that. Or even more alive is the possibility that there are other factors that are in the background and are causing both of those. And many important social scientists have talked about those things. One was Montesquieu, who, in addition to, of course, formulating one of the bedrock ideas that's incorporated into inclusive institutions, some sort of separation of powers, he also was very interested in what makes different countries rich or poor and what makes different countries have different ways of approaching the world. And he put a lot of emphasis on geographic factors. For example, he thought that in hot climates, people would be not as hardworking. As a result, they would be poorer. And he added, well, because they are lazier, they can't also govern themselves. So his theory of separation of powers was only applicable to temperate climates. So as a result, you see Montesquieu's ideas would suggest a relationship like the one that I've shown you, but the causality is nowhere to be found because it's being caused by these geographic or other omitted characteristics. So how do we make progress here in terms of trying to cut through this morass and see whether some aspects of institutions impact prosperity, and if they do, what aspects and how do we understand their effects? So the work that I've done with Simon Johnson and James Robinson was essentially aimed at trying to make progress on this. And we wanted to look into an episode where we could, based on some theory, and I'll talk a little bit about that theory, we could make an attempt to cut through some of these difficulties and say a little bit more about whether there is a causal effect of some dimensions of institutions. Colonialism is a natural one. Not only is it one of the most important events of the last millennium, but it's one which really shaped the institutional trajectories of, about 2/3 of the world. So if you want to think about colonialism as one of the shocks that changed the institutional pathways of many countries, I think that's a good starting point. The other thing that's interesting about colonialism is, of course, there is a literature, and one could have more about, what's the effect of colonialism in the abstract, but the average effect doesn't seem so easy to think through because they're so heterogeneous. So in this first picture that I showed you, I put a couple of countries in green, a couple of countries in purple. Well, those are at the very bottom and at the very top of this institutional index, and they're all former colonies. So there's a huge amount of variation in institutions, essentially the same amount of variation as you have in the entire sample when you just focus in the former colonies sample. So whatever the colonialism did, it created a very divergent trajectory for the institutions of the countries that came under European dominance. Oops, sorry, went in the wrong way. So to understand that, to think about why colonialism could have an effect, several hundred years after some of the countries, and at least 80 or 60, 70 years after the latest countries were were granted their independence, we need to also think about persistence of institutions and what are the institutional choices starting from a particular history. So this is what I'm going to briefly talk about, and let me actually put my watch here so that I know what the time is. So here is a schematic representation of a very simple umbrella framework within which we can think about some of these questions. And if you want to think about it, of course, I'm not going to go into the game theoretic details or anything like that, but this is sort of a dynamic framework where two variables, which I'm calling political institutions and distribution of resources, are state variables, meaning you take them from history, that's where historical persistence is going to come from, and then they activate certain other social, economic, and political forces then that determine both the links between institutional features and prosperity and also how institutions and other aspects evolve. So in particular, here what I'm emphasizing is that these two things, these two state variables together determine two dimensions of political power: de jure political power, by which I mean political power allocated by institutions. So for example, if you're a king, you can make certain decisions, or if you're a president, you have certain rights or capabilities, or as citizens you can vote in some places and not in others. And de facto political power, which is essentially power that exists but not necessarily allocated by institutions. So if you are able to lobby, or if you are able to convince people, or if you're able to hire thugs in order to intimidate your rivals, that's de facto power. So it's the sum total of these de facto and de jure power that then influences collective decisions. And here I am emphasizing two collective decisions. One is economic institutions, so these aspects such as property rights, what contracts you can write, who the laws apply to, what laws, etc. Those are part of the economic institutions. And what I'm interested in here especially is this red link, which is how economic institutions shape various economic outcomes, which here I'm focusing on two of them, which is economic performance in terms of aggregates, such as GDP per capita that I showed you, and the distribution of resources inequality, which I'm going to talk a lot more in a little bit. And the same things also influence political institutions. So now you see the possibility of political institutions persisting. So for example, in a framework like this, you can get not so interesting, but clear institutional stasis. You have a particular type of political institutions, it self-replicates itself, but I'm going to put much more emphasis on other types of persistence or path dependence in a second. And then it also, via the same sort of things, you can also get the distribution of resources change or replicate itself. So this is sort of one organizing framework, but it doesn't help us at this level of generality about why, the United States was in purple, was in green in that previous figure, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo is in purple at the very bottom. Why did they end up with very different sorts of institutions? So that's the second link of the theory, and essentially this is another schematic representation. And I want to now start from the last link, which I call D. This is the one that we want to think about, current institutions and the relationship between current institutions and current performance. On the basis of the previous sort of schematic representation, there are possibilities under certain circumstances for institutional persistence. So there's a causal link between early institutions and current institutions. So whatever institutional structure was set up during the or emerged during the colonial era could have this impact on current institutions, and that's what I want to trace in order to turn that variation that I showed in the first picture into something that can be more easily exploited. Now, what were the determinants of these early institutions? I think one thing that you'll see immediately, if you look at this picture here, that there is some commonality here. So among those green places that have very good institutions, you have US, Australia, Canada, New Zealand. So those are essentially colonies where there were very large numbers of European settlements. Whereas if you look at the bottom, the purple ones had very little European settlements. So why could that matter? Well, it could matter for a variety of reasons, but one that our work sort of emphasizes, and I'm going to sort of go into slightly more detail in 10 minutes on this, in places where Europeans themselves settled, the lower strata of the Europeans turned out to be a force of resistance against certain institutional designs. So European colonial authorities couldn't do in northeastern United States or in Jamestown what they did, say, in Ghana or in Jamaica or in Barbados. So there is a possibility, at least, that there is then another causal effect from settlements to early institutions that could be part of the pathways via which things that Europeans ended up doing or chose to do could have these long persistent effects. But settlements themselves are very highly endogenous as well. If you worry about the endogeneity of institutions, so should you about the endogeneity of settlements. You know, Barbados, for example, one of the very harsh slave colonies, had a lot of Europeans because it was the richest part of the world and it was a great way to make money for the Brits at the time, or the English people at the time. So, so settlements themselves could be themselves responding to potential for economic change or other sort of conditions. So the idea that Simon Johnson, James Robinson, and I sort of have explored, therefore, is that something else that potentially is more primitive than settlements was the source of variation. And there are a couple of things there that we've explored. But today I'm just going to talk about settler mortality. One of the things that was really remarkable at the time is that Europeans faced very, very different health conditions in different parts of the world. And these were health conditions that they very well understood, and newspapers wrote about them. And so it was a very important potential determinant of where they might even consider going and settling. We call that potential settler mortality because the variation was so wide in some places because of things like malaria, yellow fever, and gastrointestinal diseases for which Europeans had no immunity. Essentially, it was a death sentence to go to those colonies. Pretty much 70-80% of everybody who went there for even a short period of time died. On the other hand, places like New Zealand and Australia were healthier than European cities. So the idea, therefore, is, this is the second part of the theory, under these causal chains and under the additional key assumption that this settler mortality doesn't, from the colonial times, doesn't have any direct effects on current performance. Now you can put these two pieces together and come up with an empirical strategy using colonialism as this lab to study how institutions were formed early on and impacted potentially current institutions and through that channel current performance. Now, I'm not going to go into the details, but essentially you see what you expect here. There's a very strong relationship between settler mortality and settlements, and there's a very strong relationship between early institutions and current institutions, and also a correlation between settlements and early institutions. So on the basis of this, what you can do then is, rather than look at the scatter plot like I showed you earlier on, exploit the variation in settler mortality in order to just isolate that channel of variation in current institutions, or in the parlance of econometrics, this is going to be the instrumental variable strategy. So here is the data. On the horizontal axis here, I'm showing the logarithm of the potential settler mortality in the colonial period, log because there's really a huge amount of variation, so doing the log sort of reduces that. There's no theoretical reason for log. And on the vertical axis, I have that same variable for institutions that I showed you earlier, the rule of law index. So you see, whatever it is, there is a very strong correlation between these two variables. So about 40% of the variation in the rule of law today still projects onto these settler mortality variables from a long time ago. Now, if you believe the theoretical steps that I have outlined, although I haven't given you enough to dispel any doubts, but at least I'm sort of trying to clarify the chain of reasoning, then you'll think that a lot of this is sort of reflecting those correlations that I showed you, the link between settler mortality of settlements and then through the persistence of institutions. But the crux of the matter is, then what does this imply for current performance? To do that, let me show you another very simple figure. So here I have the same horizontal variable on the horizontal axis, but now on the vertical axis I have GDP per capita today. So the same variable that I used as the omnibus measure for prosperity in the first slide. You also see a very strong relationship in here. And under the assumption that this settler mortality variable doesn't have a direct effect, or doesn't have a direct effect on once you control for certain covariates that could be related to current health conditions, it doesn't actually matter that much, then this relationship should be working through exactly the chain of effects that I have outlined. So that's essentially the idea of the IV estimate here, and putting these two pieces together, what I'm showing now is the IV estimate on exactly the same graph, or in a sister of the same graph that I showed in the first slide, rule of law on the horizontal axis, GDP per capita on the vertical axis. But now the line is not the scatter plot, but is the estimated causal effect, or the estimated effect of the institutional variable index on GDP per capita. And it looks pretty similar to the scatter plot. It's not the same. And it also explains quite a big chunk, about 40 to 50% of the variation. So again, this is a little bit higher than what I would have chosen if I could choose that number. 50% sounds too big, 25% would have been better, but it is what it is. Now, how does that work? So that's where I want to come to the second part of both what I've been interested in from the beginning and what I think is very important for thinking about institutions' prosperity and the pathways between them that are even important today. One of the major things that institutions do is they shape incentives, especially incentives for long-term investments, innovation, technology choice, other things that affect the organization of production and its efficiency. And in line with that, if you repeat exactly the same exercise under the same assumptions, and you put on the left-hand side not GDP per capita, but one of its determinants, which is the efficiency of production or how advanced the technology is, you can use a variety of measures for that, you find similarly very strong relationships. So here I'm showing you that with two variables. One is the omnibus measure that economists use all the time for measuring the efficiency of production, total factor productivity. And on the right, I'm using a measure that's, I think, perhaps slightly more informative about how advanced the technology that countries use, which is the fraction of exports of a country that fall into the categories that the Census Bureau classifies as advanced technology. So with both measures, you see that, at least on the surface, technology seems to be a very key aspect of how technology and efficiency of production seem to be very important aspects of how institutions impact. And that's the sort of what I want to do in the next 20 minutes or so, which is I want to now think about how we can, in a slightly more unified way, talk about institutions, power, political, social, economic power, technology, and prosperity. And to do that, I'm going to do something that's not completely unfamiliar to economists, which is I'm going to define a frontier and think about things that shift that frontier versus move that frontier, or move along that frontier. And the frontier, I'm going to call it a utility technology possibilities frontier. Why? Because what I want to think about is utility, or you can think of it as income, of different groups in society, and how this is impacted both by various institutional factors, but also about technology choices, as well as the relationship between technology and institutions. So visualize something like this. although it doesn't need to be in 2 dimensions, but 2 dimensions is quite convenient. On the horizontal axis, you have one group. On the vertical axis, you have another group. And I've used labels P and R, so you can think of this as sort of income-based, poor versus rich. But rich could be colonialists or landowners, and poor could be indigenous populations in the colonial context, or it could be peasants, or it could be workers, and in different applications that I'll consider in a second, I'll talk about 1 or 2 of these. So as frontiers in economics often do, this is downward sloping, meaning there's a trade-off. You can get more, you can give more to the rich, but that comes at the expense of giving less to the poor, or you can give more to the poor, and that comes at the expense of giving less to the rich. So one of the things that I think is very relevant in this context is how much of these moves along the frontier are due to technological choices, and also, moreover, in what way the institution-technology interactions shift this frontier in and out. So here is one way of starting this conversation. So let's start on the blue frontier. So a point like B, which is very good for the poor, relatively good for the poor and not so good for the rich, might correspond, for example, in a world where we think of the poor as workers and the rich as firm owners or managers. In point B, you might have strong unions that negotiate high wages. And if you have institutional change or other things that make unions weaker, then you'll move along the frontier and you come to a point like A, which is much more favorable to the rich and less favorable to the poor because wages have declined or other things have changed. But there are also some of these aspects, like changing the balance of power, that will impact both the technology choices, potentially in efficient or inefficient ways, or they may introduce other inefficiencies. So some of those will move you along the frontier, and some of them will shift the frontier. So when you go from frontier, the blue frontier to the red frontier, now what you can achieve in terms of the incomes or the utility of the 2 groups is worse. So all else equal, the red frontier is not that great. But I have specifically picked up a point here, this point C, to emphasize that, well, even though you're in this worst frontier C, worst frontier, the red one, this point C is actually better for the rich than point B. So depending on the instruments that you use and how technology choices are affected, some groups may actually be better off when worse arrangements overall are possible. And this is my entry point for thinking about how institutions shift the frontier. I think many of the ways, not all, but many of the ways in which institutions shift the frontier are in fact related to technology. There are hold-up issues. When you have too much power in the hands of some group, they cannot refrain from using it, as we know and emphasize a lot in organizational economics, for example, and that hold-up is going to have a particularly bad effect on the efficiency of production, innovation, and so on. You can have things that I've explored in other parts of my work, when weak institutions create more conflict that can lead to collapse of state capacity. Or they can change how you do science or experimentation or other things that influence collective knowledge building, some things that I'm working on right now. But I want to talk, just to explain how this framework works, about 2 things, 2 other things, which I'm going to call economic losers and political losers. Those are those names will make slightly more sense after I explain them. So let me try to explain this by thinking of a society that starts at point C. And imagine that this society has access to either to an institutional reform or to the introduction of a new technology. So the institutional reform that we have in mind might be, for example, that at point C you have a monopoly, and that monopoly creates both markups that are inefficient and other potential inefficiencies. And the institutional reform might be, will get rid of the monopoly and create more competition. Okay. So, but if who holds that monopoly is also something you need to care about, and it's not unreasonable to assume that the rich are going to be those who enjoy the profits from the monopoly. So now imagine what happens if we disband the monopoly, some new firms enter, some other things take place, but even though that shifts us to the below frontier, it doesn't completely work out so well for the rich who've lost their privileges due to monopoly. So that's the reason why I've drawn this point C to be better for the rich than point B. So the utility of the rich under point C is greater than point B. Of course, the poor are doing very well. They're going both along the frontier to a point that's better for them because now they're not subject to the monopoly and the overall frontier has improved. But here is the problem. If the rich group here who were enjoying the fruits of monopoly also are politically powerful, they may actually not want this. So even though we have a pathway for a better organization of the economy, perhaps better institutions, because distribution of resources and the efficiency of arrangements are not completely separable, there may be a resistance, and this resistance comes from the groups who are losing economically. They are going to lose their economic rents, and that's why they are objecting to it. Now, one immediate question that you might have at the back of your mind is, well, why not allow this change, but then use other instruments to go from point B to point A? So in some sense, this economic losers mechanism has baked into it that those instruments are not there or cannot be used. So now let me introduce the sister mechanism for this, which I'm going to argue actually is more important in many settings, including the colonial context. That's why I'm actually sort of spending the time on it, which by analogy I'm going to call political losers. So the idea is very simple. Now I say, let's start from exactly the same place. Imagine again it's like a monopoly. But now allow enough instruments that once we go to the blue frontier, the state or whatever other groups have the ability to engage in redistribution or policies can actually engineer point A. But instead, there are non-trivial political dynamics. So it's not unreasonable to think that a considerable part of the political power of the rich came from the fact that they had this monopoly. Now, if you disband the monopoly, they may temporarily be able to get something out of that, but the social basis of their political power has disappeared. So then what you might expect is that once that happens, because they are going to ultimately lose their political power, there are going to be forces to move along the frontier because of the institutional or power dynamics that are induced. And when that happens, today they can get A, but in the future they expect to get B because their political power is going to be eroded. But if you care about the future and you expect quick transition from A to B, now you're going to have the same sort of issue that the rich may not be so willing, even though they have the instruments and even though they may be certain that in the short run they may get some compensatory changes in other fiscal policies. So both economic losers and political losers are forces for distorting to technology institutional choices, and they're also forces for political persistence. Now, this framework doesn't just generate political persistence, it also has within it possibilities for political change. I don't want to go too much into the details of this, but this is sort of a representation of some of the work that, for example, I did in the context of the emergence of democracy, persistence or collapse of democracy with Jim Robinson. And the idea here is that even if you start at a point like C, what the groups that are politically powerful have is often de jure power. They control the political system, but they don't control all de facto political power. And especially if the excluded groups are sufficiently numerous, when they solve their collective action problem, they can at least temporarily have significant political power that could rock the boat. And when that happens, you have some possibilities. You can engage in repression, or you can try to make some concessions. But the problem with that de facto power is that it's transitory. You can make a concession like from going from point C to B, but everybody should understand that those concessions are not going to be long lasting. So as a result, when those concessions are not enough and repression is not super attractive for a variety of reasons, for example, the British elites tried that and didn't work out so well for them, then there may be reasons for accepting institutional change, for example, extension of the franchise, and that's exactly the story of the gradual expansion of voting rights in Britain, where, for example, in the context of the First Reform Act, the liberal politicians, people like Lord Grey, were very much saying, we need to do these reforms in order to protect the system, because if you don't do it, the tensions are too big that the same situation cannot last forever. Now, I want to now go back to the colonial period, and I want to think about how this framework helps us think about why it is that in different colonies, different institutional choices were made. And I think the most important point to bear in mind is that in almost all the colonies, there was a huge power imbalance. Colonial authorities, once they took control of these societies, they had much better organizational, military, and other capabilities. And that huge power imbalance meant that they could shape at least some aspects of institutions. Now, one way you can think about that is that you move along the frontier. They choose policies that are good for them and bad for society. That certainly happened, but given the colonial setting, they had limited access to fiscal instruments. So they couldn't tax the population in efficient ways. So instead, what they ended up doing is they created fundamentally inefficient economic arrangements, such as slavery, encomienda, other things that tied people to the land or introduced coercive systems, because those were the ways of raising revenues or tribute in the most feasible way, in a less institutionalized and less sort of endowed with complex fiscal instruments. But another force was also always in the background. Even though there is this huge power imbalance, colonial authorities were continuously worried about keeping control. And keeping control is just a code word for political losers. So they were continuously worried about, if we change this system, how will that affect the political dynamics and will it completely sideline us? So those were some of the reasons why you see these very extensively inefficient economic and related arrangements in most of the colonies. But why not in the settler colonies? The evidence is fairly clear that European colonial authorities had very similar incentives. It's not that they said, oh, we want to do something else in North America or in Australia. They tried more or less the same things. It just didn't work. It didn't work because the same huge power imbalance didn't exist. Without that huge power imbalance, they couldn't shape the institutions in the same inefficient ways and resist the political losers mechanism. So political power gradually shifted away from them. But I think there's one more theoretical piece that I want to introduce, and which helps us understand both the colonial context and some other episodes a little bit more. And that's the idea of what Jim Robinson and I have called critical junctures. By critical junctures, we mean periods in which there are disruptive changes, social, economic, technological, military, so that existing institutional arrangements are challenged and their stability is in real question. And I think there are two ways in which critical junctures can be conceptualized to change the picture. And to do that, let me go back to my red and blue frontiers as before, and think of the shift from the red to blue, say due to an institutional arrangement, as the normal period. Now imagine a critical juncture has come. For example, a new technology or a completely new type of interaction is in the picture. Then if you do the same institutional change, its consequences could be much more extensive. So the economic implications of having more inclusive institutions would have been much smaller without the industrial technology as it was in the 19th century. And in fact, that's part of the reason why, I'm not going to show you that data, but if you look at when the divergence between, say, South America and North America took place, it didn't take place in the 16th century or the 17th century. It's really at the end of the 18th and really much in the 19th century. So I'm going to capture that by saying that during critical junctures, the shift out from the same institutional change would be much larger. But that's not all, because critical junctures, because they destabilize existing institutional arrangements, they also increase the incentive of existing political elites to use other means, including repression and other inefficient means, in order to maintain the status quo. But that doesn't maintain the status quo, it makes it worse. So critical junctures will also lead to worsening of institutions. So therefore, critical junctures are really a point of divergence, that things that were somewhat different now become much more potentially different. And it happens in a way that you can say path dependent, so it's definitely not institutional status, things are changing, and it happens in some contingent or stochastic ways. You cannot ex ante always know which of two similar societies is going to loosen its institutional grip, and the other one, which one is going to even double down on it. Now, this really matters because it illustrates why small differences create bigger potentials for divergence during these critical juncture periods. So in some sense, colonialism was a critical juncture. The environmental differences existed. There were more diseases in some places, and some of those diseases were the ones that were very localized, etc. But those differences didn't matter much. Local populations had fairly extensive acquired immunity and sometimes genetic immunity to diseases that were endemic in their places. But then Europeans coming without that immunity creates a critical juncture, and that's where this big divergence takes place. Another place where you see the big divergence is actually in the context of industrialization in Europe. So in the 18th century, Europe had a lot of institutional differences, say, between places like the Habsburg Empire or Russia and France or bigger differences with the UK. But there aren't huge economic differences. And then you can think of the 19th century as another critical juncture because of industrial technology becoming available, railways, factories, and so on. But the way that different countries with these existing institutional differences respond to them are very, very different. So France, despite some institutional ups and downs, embraces many of these industrial technologies and starts growing very rapidly. The Habsburg Empire takes a very different tone. So in the words of one of the lawmakers, we do not desire that all that great masses shall become well off and independent. How could we otherwise rule over them? So they actually, both Russians and Austria-Hungary or Habsburgs were very much against railways and industrial technology because they thought exactly the political losers mechanism, we will lose control. So this is another critical junctures leading to this divergence. So I'm going to come back to AI and our current period as another critical juncture. But before I do that, let me sort of carry the story a little bit more to the present. Because what I want to talk about for the present is that A, the same institutions still matter. B, democracy especially is a very important part of it because, you know, you can talk of some proto-democratic elements in, say, the assemblies that got formed in the northeast of the United States, but there's no democracy to speak of in the 19th century around the world. So I want to talk about that, but I want to also talk about democracy because I want to dispel the notion that all I'm talking about are historical institutions. And in fact, one of the nice things about, if you look at it today, there are some aspects of institutions that still project on history, and there are some aspects of it, whether countries democratize and how those democracies change, that has very little projection or very little relationship to these historical things. But then I want to also talk about the current institutional problems and why they may be, and then bring those back to the technology institution axis. All right, so here is the raw data that I think tells a very interesting story about democracy. So what this raw data does is that we use one coding, but it doesn't matter which one you use, but it's a binary coding, so each country is either a non-democracy or democracy. And then for each non-democracy that democratizes, call that 0 for that country's 0, and then compare that country's GDP to all others that have remained non-democracy. So that's this data as an aggregate across these. So this is the raw data. There's no statistical procedure applied. It's just the year 0 has been defined according to the democratization for each country. Now, when you look at this picture, I think there are a couple of things that are very telling. So I think first, you see that democratizations happen after economic problems. That's actually a very common feature in the data. Most authoritarian countries don't voluntarily become democratic. Second, after democratization, on average, there's a little bit of anemic growth, but then it sort of picks up around year 7 or so, and then there's much faster growth thereafter. So it's very difficult looking at this picture to tell the story that democracies are malfunctioning and authoritarianism is better for economic growth. Now, it's important, this picture is not comparing Switzerland to China. It's within country comparison, essentially. So it's the same country before and after democratization. And it also explains why there is still a raging debate on what the effects of democracy are. If you have this general pattern, and then you aggregate data in various different ways, you're going to get all sorts of effects depending on where you put the trough versus the pickup, etc. But here it is, the same thing after just a very little bit of econometrics where you condition on countries' own lags of GDP per capita, which seems to be enough to get rid of that big sort of dip. And you can see that the same thing as you could have seen from the other picture, that countries that democratize increase their GDP per capita by about 20% relative to countries or relative to their own trend, or relative to countries that don't democratize. So there is a fairly sizable benefit for democracy, and this democracy completely is separate from these historical institutions. So there's a very different type of variation, and it includes a lot of basket case democracy. So these are not handpicked democracies that, oh yeah, this is the country that has sort of consolidated. So Argentina is in here many times because they transition to democracy, last 1 year, they go back, and so on. So even with those, democracies are associated with this significant improvements. By the way, it's not just that, it's also reversal. So if you go back from democracy to authoritarianism, you get the same thing, but in reverse. And democracies also do quite well in terms of, I don't have that picture, sorry, I thought I did, on other things like infant mortality, education, etc. And here it is, not from this more semi-parametric, but this, if you did this linear regression, I show you the same thing as I did there, but now I'm picking on one country, South Korea. And the reason why I'm doing that is because South Korea is sort of a leading example that people give for authoritarianism led to good growth performance. Well, here it is, South Korean performance before democracy, and here it is after democracy. So within country variation for South Korea, Taiwan, for Brazil, etc., those are the kinds of cases that are deriving that relationship. So democracy is one aspect of institutions that coheres with the stories that I was telling, and it gives the same sort of results. It's also true that historical institutions are not completely irrelevant. So a lot of the divergence based on historical institutions had happened by the 1960s, but if you look at economic growth since then, you still get some of that historical part mattering. So in other words, the story that, at least that emerges from the data, which is what I think makes a lot of sense, is that there is a component that is historical, that's persistent, is not there fully, but that persistence still has implications. And there are other social dynamics, such as those that lead to democratization, that still have very big effects. So then the question is, why is it that democracy is in a bit of a crisis. In fact, the democracy is in crisis in many different ways, but one that I have studied and is very strong as a descriptive fact in the data, support for democracy is at an all-time low. So if you ask people what their views of democracy, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, that was much more favorable than it is now. And I think part of the reason is because democracy performed quite well, and that's what the historical variation that I'm exploiting here, or not, it's quite historical over the last 60, 70 years, but it also built a lot of aspirations. And those aspirations were not out of sync with what it was doing. I think the most important three aspirations that democracy created is shared prosperity, no group is left behind, effective provision of public goods and non-corruption, and voice, that people actually can express their opinions and there's a process of self-government. And I think none of this were perfect, but if you look at the decades, for example, that followed World War II, democracies were doing quite well in all of these respects. But if you look at it since then, say the last 50 years, I think democracy is underperforming relative to its past and perhaps relative to aspirations. It still doesn't mean authoritarian countries are going to do better, and I think if you look at recent data, you again see that. But democracy relative to its own standards is failing. And why is it failing? Well, before I talk about why it's failing, so here is one figure from a recent paper of mine, has many co-authors, so I'm not going to name them to save time, that essentially gives a little bit of backing to that claim, which is that if you look at countries, democratic countries that are successful in terms of economic growth, controlling corruption, stability, and public goods, they do well in terms of support, but when democracy underperforms, you lose that. Corruption is especially important. There's a very nice paper when Sumitra was here by Sumitra and my student Eduardo Rivera, which does an excellent job of really zeroing in on this corruption problem in Latin America and then with an RCT in Mexico. And what they find is exactly that when there are big corruption scandals, that those are associated with much less support for incumbent parties and people becoming more soured on democracy, and that the RCT supports mechanisms that I think at least I'm interpreting as in line with all of these things. So how is it that we know in general democracy is not doing very well? Well, I think economic conditions have changed. So in some sense, the 50s, 60s, 70s were not just periods of shared prosperity, but they were also periods of rapid economic growth, which made it easy to sort of deliver some of the things that people wanted in terms of public good expenditure, health, education, roads became much better with more resources, but also, let me skip that since time is running short, so let me not talk about other industrialized countries, but also the shared prosperity picture really changed in a dramatic way. So here I'm plotting the evolution of real hourly earnings. So this is weekly earnings, sorry, the same thing for hourly, but real weekly earnings for 10 demographic groups, men versus women, and 5 education categories, all the way from people without a high school degree to those with postgraduate degrees. If you look at the 1960s and early 1970s, and the same pattern you get in the 1950s, except that you don't observe the postgraduates, so you have to put the college graduates and the postgraduates together, those curves are on top of each other. The real wages of these groups are growing in tandem. In fact, in the 50s, low education groups are experiencing faster real world wage growth than more educated groups. So inequality, at least the education dimension, is narrowing. Other dimensions are narrowing as well. From 1980 onwards, you have a very different picture, a huge opening up of these gaps. So this is one of the exhibits that you can bear in mind about why shared prosperity isn't working out so well. What's going on? Well, I think what's going on is partly that the economy is changing, and perhaps institutions could have adjusted to it in some ways but didn't, but the economic change is very real. So I think most labor economists and other people who study it link the increase in inequality to how we are using technology. Either you can call it skill-biased technological change, or in my work I emphasize how digital technologies were used for automation. But the pathways for shared prosperity, which was, firms expand, they reach the mass market, and to do that, they hire a lot of workers. As they hire a lot of workers, that bids up wages. That was the mechanism that led to the concurrent increase in the real wages of all groups. That got broken because now firms hire either more skilled workers, or they expand, but they use robots or numerically controlled machinery, or increasingly software systems and AI in order to do that production, so that the trickle down to labor doesn't work. So why is that? Well, let me use the framework and think of the current period of digital technologies, and especially of AI, as another critical juncture. So, and here I'm going to conclude with this and the next slide, linking it to the way in which we can think of bringing all of these things together in the context of the framework that I presented. So now think of the rich as an amalgam of capital owners and perhaps managers and the very highly qualified workers like engineers, computer scientists, etc. And the poor as like lower education manual workers. So let's imagine that we start on this red frontier and at a point like B0. Now I think from the 1970s onwards, there are two concurrent changes, and I'm not going to take a position on which one causes the other or whether the two are independent. One is that the balance of power is changing. Unions are becoming stronger. Ideas like Friedman's, the responsibility of shareholders is, the responsibility of managers is just to only to increase shareholder value. So firms are becoming much more focused on labor cost cutting. So you can think of that as a change from B0 to B1. So if nothing else had happened, you would have some more inequality because of this. But the big change that happened is that within that institutional context, you also have the digital technologies, and digital technologies created new pathways for saving costs, especially if you use them for automation. And that I'm drawing here as this shift from the red to the blue frontier. And the way that I have drawn the blue frontier is to emphasize that this is a real twist. So it's not in or out, but it's making things much harder for labor, because the pathways for labor to take a slice from the increased productivity or increased prosperity is being curtailed because of automation. Now, that could itself be viewed as a critical juncture that leads to all of the social changes. And I think that's one direction that some of my work tries to develop it. But the final thing that I want to do is I want to say, well, with AI, we have yet another, or perhaps a continuation of that critical juncture. And the reason for that is because AI, just like any other technology, just digital technologies, but perhaps even more, is a very versatile framework. You can use it for many things. If you use AI now as a continuation of automation, and if you excessively do that, it's going to not just exacerbate the same tensions that I have emphasized, but it might not actually deliver that much productivity growth because you're doing it excessively. So how you use technology has implication both for the distribution but also the efficiency of production. And the reason why I am emphasizing that and thinking of this as a critical juncture is because AI as an information technology has the capability to be used for other things. And one aspect that I have tried to emphasize in some of my work, and again sort of stresses the importance of choice within this important context, is that you can use AI in a more pro-worker direction, meaning use AI in order to make workers better informed, enable them to boost their expertise, increase the tasks or more sophisticated tasks that they can perform. Imagine using AI to make electricians or plumbers more efficient or nurses more efficient. And if you do that, then that's like the same thing that I showed you earlier on in the previous slide, but in reverse. So you can go from the blue frontier to something like the black frontier. So actually the opposite twist, because now you're creating new pathways for workers. So the reason why I am ending with this is because I think this is a very important moment, both because AI is absolutely a transformative technology, but as I have tried to indicate, the inequality implications and how the digital technologies have changed the labor market and the industrial economy are very important for their social implications, including for institutions, but also it's an institutional choice to influence how we use technology and what direction it's going to go in. So let me conclude there, because I've tried to bring in many things. I'm not going to try to give a summary, but I wanted to just share some of these thoughts with you, and thank you very much for inviting me again.
Thank you very much, Daron. This was a wonderful tour through many years of work, and as well very thought-provoking. With that, I'm going to welcome to the podium Doug McCune, who will present to you this award, and with many thanks.
Thank
for
you.
Being
My
with
pleasure.
Us.
Well, my honor.
I just have just a few words, but that was very exciting. I've been reading your most recent book recently, and all of this obviously ties in very, very well. So thank you for having me here. I've had a great night tonight. I'm very happy to be representing Sage Publishing. At Sage, as an academic publisher, we like to say that our mission is to build bridges to knowledge. That starts typically with the primary research, the academic paper, and you know a whole lot about that. You have published literally hundreds of academic research papers, including some of the most influential work now in the field of economics. But academic research is really only the starting point. In terms of making that work matter, it has to go beyond just the paper. Other people have to be influenced by your work. And in your case, you are typically cited as the either single most or one of the top most cited economists in the last decade. But even beyond that, if you're trying to aim for larger impact, public policy impact, you need more than just the staying within the academic bubble, the bubble of academia. And you need to get out and really get your ideas into the more mainstream. And in your case, you know this very well because of all the highly regarded books you've written. For me, as a decidedly non-economist, that's my mechanism of engaging with some of these ideas. And it's been fantastic to have that entry point that's a little more accessible than some of the academic research. I can definitely say that's allowed me to sort of digest some of these ideas, particularly around technology and democracy, as we've seen here. And I know that obviously you'll be continuing all this work as it becomes even more important in this world of rising authoritarianism and the promise, and then of course also the danger of ever-present AI in everything that we do in society. So with that, I'm honored to be able to present the Sage-CASBS Award. Let me swing around here. The Sage-CASBS Award from 2025.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much. Take that.